Welcome to our presentation. We are the Victoria University Play Team, and we're using this presentation as an opportunity to further document our experiences at Mini Maddern, a pop-up play space in Maddern Square, Footscray. In the course of this presentation, you'll hear from people who filled a range of roles in this project: academics, mentors, and students.
I'm talking to you from Wurundjeri land, and my colleagues with whom this work was done live on Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung and Wadawurrung land. I acknowledge that these lands are in the custodianship of the Aboriginal people of the Kulin Nations and have been the sites of learning and of play for millennia. I acknowledge their leaders, past, present and emerging. These lands have never been ceded and no treaty has ever been signed. The land I speak to you from always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
So let me tell you a little bit about Maddern Square. In order to do this project, we partnered with Public Realm Lab, who are an architect group, and the local city council. And our job was to reactivate Maddern Square via a 12-week residency. So Maddern Square is in Footscray. It's an inner city suburb in the industrialised west of Melbourne. It has high density living and very little green space. The idea of bringing children and families into this square via a play space was initiated by Public Realm Lab. And when we were invited to partner with them, we sought to make this a pop-up play space, a place of adventure and imagination using loose parts and all conducted through a playwork lens. So along with the architects and the teaching staff at VU and our early childhood students, we gathered loose parts over several months and brainstormed how that place would be presented. So come March to June 2021, more than 150 of our early childhood students undertook placement at Mini Maddern. All the students and mentors did a 3-hour orientation to playwork prior to coming into the space. And it was really well supported by local families. It fell between the two quite long lockdowns in Melbourne and gave people a chance to reconnect. So midweek, the attendance was around about 5 to 25 children a day, but on the weekends we had between about 25 and 80 children a day. And we filled it with loose parts, with crates and fabrics and paint and craft, a quiet space, a sand pit and a water tank. We had pieces of timber, pine cones, leaves and twigs, cardboard boxes, tyres, PVC piping, bottles, lids, ribbon, string, fabric, masking tape, polystyrene noodles, and anything that would roll. And we were really mindful in gathering these loose parts of what McClure calls the lively potential of objects, so that pedagogically, emotionally, and socially, we wanted to acknowledge the capacity for wonder that can come through contact with a material object. We wanted to open up that space of wonder as a way of thinking about the new. And each day we set up differently and each day we packed up differently.
As a mentor, I would love these students to learn the value of child-led play, especially through the lens of using loose parts. By loose parts, it's a great opportunity to use recyclable, sustainable materials, boxes, cardboard, crates, old fabric, pool noodles, masking tape thrown all together. We don't need to work out what to do with it. The children will tell us.
However, this public space in Maddern Square is a space with a history. So Avery Gordon talks about haunted places, and Maddern Square fits that definition really well. It's a hidden pocket in an inner urban area. It's surrounded by the backs of shops. And for almost 2 decades, it's been identified by the local council as, for want of a better term, a problem space. It wasn't actually empty when we went in there. In fact, it has a regular community of people who inhabit Maddern Square. Mostly people who we might consider dispossessed. They don't have really anywhere else to go. It's also full of literally hundreds of pigeons and quite a few rats. So this is not the most salubrious place in Footscray in order to be running a pop-up play space. There's a lot of evidence of drugs and alcohol use in Maddern Square. There are some people who sleep rough there in the square at night. And the behaviour of the inhabitants can often appear to be, particularly to outsiders, but also sometimes to insiders, to be quite unpredictable. So when we first started there, some of the local inhabitants warned us about others, and they said, they'll steal your stuff, they'll break your stuff, and they'll get violent. There's this real sense that lingering in that space, there were all sorts of repressed forms of violence that brought a feeling of an urgency into the present moment when we were there. So prior to us being there in this space with children, families may have walked through Maddern Square, they may have also avoided it, but they would not have stopped and played very often at all. So there were 3 groups came together to do this project. There was Victoria University, Public Realm Lab and Maribyrnong City Council. And we all had different aims, ultimately. And at times, these felt like they were competing. So we, as a team at VU, needed to work really hard to listen, to have conversations, to discuss what our aims were, and to try and understand the aims of the other contributors to the project. So for us, our aims included children having agency in public space, having ownership of that space through play. But because it was a haunted place, it also required more. So for the VU team, we were very taken by Haraway's idea of responsibility, and we used that as a key concept. Now, normally when we talk about responsibility, it's very individualistic. It's like, yeah, I take responsibility for that. But when we break the word up like Haraway does and talk about responsibility, what we're doing is we're recognizing that we're in relationship with the place, the other people, and the things and creatures that are in that space with us. So that we're in relationship and we're acting with agency in response to that relationship. That was really ultimately what we sought to do for ourselves as a team working in that space, and to give the families and children the opportunity to also be part of that.
Mini Maddern is about children and families making connections to their community in Footscray and surrounding suburbs. It's also about children making connection to place and coexisting in a space where everyone has access to those connections. To make true connections, we need to go beyond the spaces that are mostly apparent in the beginning. We need to dig a little bit deeper to find out ways to connect a whole community on the same level, so about that coexisting in a space, and that's been a really big part of this project for me, and reaching out to local businesses, to the local community in lots of different ways to make that kind of come together.
Malaguzzi, in A Charter of Rights, says that children are constructors of their own experience and thus active participation in the organisation of their abilities, identities, autonomy through relationships and interactions with their peers, with adults, with ideas, with objects, and with the real and imaginary events of intercommunicating worlds. I see a connection here with the idea of responsibility. Bozilek and Zembalas put it very nicely when they say responsibility holds that we come into being and are rendered capable through multi-directional relationships. Children are capable and competent, but we also recognize their vulnerability and our role in protecting them. So here we needed to grapple with the best thing to do for children in this particular space. Was it to avoid the space altogether, or to trust children to be able to think carefully about the people who lived in the same community where they lived, the people they saw every day, or who we may have hidden from them. As Rinaldi said, children are the human beings who know how to question themselves and others, to be surprised and ask why, to change patterns and expectations, and at the same time, innovate. Was she thinking of Maddern Square when she wrote this in 2020? Possibly not, but she was contemplating the child as citizen when she did. She calls the rights of the child as citizen a fragile right, one that we are still working out, the one called into question during lockdowns that occurred during the world, including in Melbourne and either side of our project. We were very much aware that children had been in lockdown for months, many unable to attend their children's services, schools, or even playgrounds. We knew that green spaces were lacking in this inner city town. So we wanted to bring children into the heart of their city. Children and families had a right to use this public space. We wanted to make this a space to play in, to feel that there was place for them in their own town, a place that they belonged and had ownership and agency and influence in the place where they lived, a place where they could create a new kind of space and develop a culture of their own by engaging with the objects that were here and with the other people that will come here as well to action their rights as citizens. But we ourselves, personally, at first did not recognise that this place, although public space, already belonged to other people. We acknowledge that we failed at first to properly recognise the people who were already here, and some of the behaviours that were in this place at first frightened us and our pre-service teachers. But we were very aware of the children. We had the children first and foremost in our minds. We needed to make sure the children were safe. There was an outward calmness to our mentors that if you're a teacher, you will know, perhaps with a racing heart, but you remaining calm to show the children that everything is okay, to show them how to be in this place with others. So we watched the children very carefully. Sometimes our perceptive student teachers would position themselves in such a way as to shepherd the play into another area to make more space for others. Sometimes people moved to other areas of the space to make room for children. Sometimes children looked with curiosity. Sometimes they were thoughtful. Sometimes they made space for people. Mostly they played. We as professionals needed to really wrestle with the idea of what it means for children to be a citizen here, with rights and responsibilities to one another. How much do we need to protect children? Can we allow children to have influence here? This is the children's city. They live here, they see this, these people are part of their community. When the children are safe, should they encounter people that we may try to keep hidden from them? It was revolutionary to see children in Reggio Emilia, in the piazza in Italy, lying on the ground, taking sketches of lions with everyone around them. Our place we might not immediately think of as a really beautiful place, but this is our place and it is public space. And we didn't want to push any people out. Do children's rights to be here mean that others cannot? So we sent a message to people that we didn't want to push them away and we invited them to stay. So I'd like to share a little story here. A man came into the square with a big paper bag filled with bread. He walked straight into the square with purpose and with direction to complete a task that he always completes. He looked straight ahead and he made no eye contact with anyone. I was hoping to share a smile, but it was apparent that he was not looking for interaction. He began to feed the pigeons, ripping large hunks of roll and throwing them into the square. Two children were mesmerized and quietly watched the pigeons and the man. They inched closer and closer to him. The adults, us, we were standing back, we were watching to see what would happen. Then, without moving his head at all, without ever looking away from the pigeons, without changing his focus, the man held out a bread roll to the side towards the children. They took this bread and, a little apart, but still side by side together, they stood silently and threw bread to the pigeons. When the bread was gone, he left. The children went to play and the pigeons flew away. As a teacher, my first automatic response was to start mentally composing a learning story here. In my mind, I was listing all the evident skills, the perception of each other that occurred, the way one person invited others to participate, the collaboration without words. But I started to reflect that perhaps it's not the skills that are important here. It's not even about the learning, it's about the encounter. This is the intercommunicating worlds. This is the coming into being through relationship, and the existence of this moment, which I, as an observer, was not part of, seemed too precious for me to even mentally reduce to fit onto my mental learning story template. There are some for whom this haunted history is very recent in this place. Some people still hurried through. Not everybody was ready to interact or to play here. We felt we needed to help children use their right to this public space in this particular community, to have this place of encounter with materials, with other children, with families, with people, and to trust the children to question themselves and others, to be surprised, to ask why, to be concerned, to change patterns and expectations, and at the same time to innovate, perhaps creating new understandings of what it means to be a citizen here, to allow them to create new understandings and to have a positive influence in this place. We hoped that as we encountered one another, even in small ways, like sharing bread with pigeons, that we could learn to interact with each other in a compassionate and understanding way.
I did speak to a parent who questioned me about a person lying under a tree and said, should we move them on? And I said, well, they belong here too. So I think, well, they're just lying under a tree, that we just leave them be. And she was like, yeah, okay. Well, that was it. That was the end of that conversation.
Yeah, I think that idea of belonging was very much in the center of our mind. How do we all belong in this place? We are all in this place. Every person has a right to belong in this place. How are we going to do that together, and to trust that children were capable of thinking through what it's like to belong in this particular community?
I think it's interesting what you said about not knowing about the inhabitant, like the people who used the space before this project, because that was a really big point of tension for me, not coming into this as a researcher quite late, but my participation began as a parent and as a resident of Footscray, and I was very aware of what Maddern Square was and what it was used for, and I was really curious about how this was going to work, and it was a place that I would go with my 3-year-old, but with some caution. And I think I had a conversation with you, Sarah, around that time about just being really interested in these social and ethical dilemmas, and you said to me that children have a right to that space too, and that really caused me to reflect on that I was thinking, actually, I don't feel very safe there with my 3-year-old, and there is a way. And the way that I saw as this went on, those considerations being made, and that VU became a voice for pushing back against that pushing out of the people that perhaps the council didn't want to be there. That really emerged for me as the project went on.
I think we just actually had to meet each other. I think when we were sharing the space together and we met people and we had conversations on the edges, and when the children and I'm going to say residents encountered each other, they got to know each other a little bit, even if they weren't having conversations. They just learnt to be together. And I think when we all got to know each other a bit better, then those encounters deepened. a little bit. So sharing that space together helped us understand each other more. And we were all responsive to each other. We all changed a little bit. I don't know if someone's talking about this later, but the people who were there were so happy to see the children, and they would say it's lovely to have the children here. Or they would say, I'm going to go and drink. I'm going to go somewhere else because the children are here. So I thought we all changed by challenging ourselves, I think, to think about this idea of children's capability, children's rights, children as citizens, to be part of a community, even if it's not perfect.
I agree, Sarah. Even the times that I was there, the young men, the disenfranchised young men who often still stayed around and sat on the edges on the wall, because it was their gathering space, and we just moved around them and they just moved around us on a sunny afternoon or a sunny morning. And even the pigeon man, a couple of us, another mentor and I spoke to him about how perhaps bird seed is more appropriate for the pigeons, and he was not happy with us, and so he walked away from us, and we just let him go. So that was interesting for us to, well, it's his right to, he can feed the birds bread if he so wishes. So and you're right, it was a challenge and it was a learning experience for me.
So I want to talk a little bit about deep listening and documentation, and ask these questions about what does the practice of deep listening enable, and how might deep listening influence our work with children, families and the community. So this concept of deep listening is a pretty far-reaching concept. There's Pauline Oliveros, who's an experimental musician from America, describing it as a radical attentiveness that helps us to change or dissolve limiting boundaries. It's also a concept where rich connections between Australian First Nations cultures and the Reggio Emilia philosophy can be found. So there's the concept of dadidi, which is becoming more widely known. It's a Nungi Kurungu word, which is a Northern Territory language, and it's described by Miriam Rose Ungamur as an inner deep listening and quiet still awareness, something like what you call contemplation. There are words for this kind of deep listening in many Indigenous languages. Closer to home, in Wergaia language from the Mallee region in Victoria, is the word Nayernila, which means listen continuously. Rinaldi provides a definition of listening that really connects to these understandings. She says that listening should be open and sensitive to the need to listen and be listened to, and the need to listen with all our senses. She says that listening is not easy. It requires a deep awareness and suspension of our judgments and prejudices. It requires openness to change. It demands that we value the unknown and overcome the feelings of emptiness and precariousness that we experience when our certainties are questioned. Listening should recognize the many languages, symbols, and codes that people use to express themselves and communicate. I want to share a story now that I think illustrates some of the ways that multiple participants at Mini Maddern were able to listen deeply. So some of the local inhabitants, as we've mentioned, they were feeling displaced. They were perceived as a threat by some of our students and mentors. There were several times when emergency services needed to be called. Once when a man took scissors from the site and threatened another man with them. Once when a young woman became verbally aggressive to a mentor because children were playing near a tree where her sister had died. Once when a group of young children took paint and graffitied a building. Once when a man collapsed from an overdose. None of this aggression was directed to the children or their carers, but it occurred in the space and it highlighted the volatility of the environment. The local council was supportive of the police being repeatedly called and an increased police presence, but that didn't seem to be the best answer. It felt confrontational and oppressive, and it meant that crises could escalate rather than be dealt with. After the first couple of incidents, we convinced the dean of our faculty to employ a security person to be on site when we were there. But there was still an ethical issue. From our perspective, the security person was not there to move on the inhabitants, but simply to intervene if people felt threatened, if people wanted to sleep on site or change their socks or feed the pigeons, we didn't want them to be interfered with. We asked the security person to hover on the edges. At first, we asked that they sit at their car. They didn't need to protect us, they just needed to intervene if anyone became violent. On reflection, perhaps we were asking this security person to do some deep listening to the site and those in it. Over time, tensions eased, and the security guard became a bridge between us and the locals. They would sit and chat, share a joke with the locals. We never knew any of these inhabitants' names, but we came to understand their routines. Each morning, we would chat to the fellow who poured his six-pack into a mug and drank it before meandering on. The elderly Vietnamese woman became our friend when she heard one of our students speaking her native dialect. The young woman whose sister had died told us her sister would have liked the children being there. And the young man who'd come to watch carefully because of his unpredictable nature had a few good days when he smiled at the children and engaged with them from a distance. On our last day, the security person was keeping the bubble machine going and was invited into the play. We discovered that sometimes deep listening was not documenting. It was respecting the wishes of the community members who did not want their words and actions photographed or recorded in any way, at least not at first. This led to a special kind of being present, and by putting down the documentation tools, we were able to be more responsive to the wishes of community members and children. Rinaldi says we think of documentation as an act of caring, an act of love and interaction. I think this extends to even what happens before we document, that this care, love and interaction is sometimes a responsiveness and acknowledgement that we need to just listen. While many moments were not formally documented, they are documented by telling these stories now, by acknowledging that these stories have changed us and in turn changed those we tell them to. Many of these stories I did not experience firsthand, and I've been affected by them as I have the privilege of sharing them. By respecting the wishes of people to not document, we were able to experience a presentness that allowed us to be more responsive, to practice Haraway's responsibility that Mary Rose referred to earlier. Rinaldi says listening to ourselves, internal listening, encourages us to listen to others, but in truth is generated when others listen to us. She tells us the young child is the first great researcher. Children are born searching for and therefore researching the meaning of life, the meaning of the self in relation to others and the world. They don't do this by taking photographs and documenting. They do this by being present and by being changed by what they are experiencing.
The best part of being part of Mini Maddern is I learned so much. I learned that children are creative learners. They are capable learners. And look at their smile. They just smile like, Mom, I can do it. Mom, I make a robot. Mom, look at my artworks. That is the most beautiful part of being part of Mini Maddern.
I love Mini Maddern because children are learning here and also I'm learning from them.
The VU early childhood students have learnt so much. Probably one of the main things is linking theory that they've learnt in their classes to placement here and actually seeing it in practice. So I've had a lot of students particularly understanding the ninja concept. So the ninja concept is stepping back and really observing children and allowing them to be in control of their own play and their own creativity, and I guess empowering children and not entering their space or intervening or interrupting, and knowing when to do that, almost looking at cues for children to invite you in.
As a mentor teacher with the Mini Maddern project, I was there to support and guide the pre-service teachers in their engagement with the children's space and play. Our discussions during and after our session was a time of reflective listening that was the beginning of the documentation of what happened during the session, and focused on thinking about the learning that occurred and possible further steps, the what next. It also raised issues of ethical dilemmas. It was a shared public space. We were the visitors. Who has the rights? What are we documenting? Who are we documenting for? How do you deal with privacy? Whose rights are challenged?
How did it change you, Anna?
More relaxed around children.
Are you?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Stepping back. It was great to actually step back. I mean, we are taught often in early childhood, we are encouraged and taught to engage with children as we prepare spaces for them. But through this project, especially linking it with the playworks theory, I saw the benefits of stepping back and observing children and letting them go, trusting them to engage with the materials, with their learning. So me as an adult, as an educator, watching them and then encouraging the students to look at children, to see what they do and to see what they're learning, that was really much part of our discussions after the session, which for me was the breakdown of that. The discussions enhanced their own documentation later, which they would write up as reflections. A very beneficial experience for them. But it was very confronting at first, especially coming into that space. It was a bit of a scary place, but it was a really great place of play and learning. And with all these other people around us and the pigeons, and yeah, a very unusual, very interesting and very out there experience, but a very, very much, like I said, innovative and very brave. To me, it really tied in with the Reggio Emilia focus in it, because it wasn't all just beautiful, but it became beautiful with the learning.
Aww.
You're right. It wasn't the piazza with the lions and children drawing the lions. But it was because the Reggio Emilia people also say you don't transpose the philosophy. You don't transpose what happens with Reggio Emilia. The philosophy is taken to where you are in your situation. And this was our situation in Footscray. It was, as I said, brave and innovative. And I was very proud to be part of it. This was very different from being in a fenced off kindergarten, early childhood space or playground. So it pushed the students to think more broadly and deeply about what they were placing out, how they were arranging the loose parts, what they were taking out of the shed and how they were placing it, how it may engage and attract children. And then when they saw children engaging with the equipment, it was really good for them to see how children could do it without adult intervention.
You know what it sounds like to me? It sounds like for you and for the students, it's a whole another level of belief in the child as capable.
Mm.
Like we say that the child is capable and we believe so much, and then we pushed ourselves and said, actually, they are more capable than I believed, even though
absolutely true.
Forever.
Yeah. Some of them talked about documentation, about linking it. Some already work in early childhood, some work in daycare. So they were aware of the obligation to document. So they were wondering about how to document the play and the learning and document what they see. So for them, it was a great experience to actually be able to stand back and look and listen to what was happening with the children.
I think in this project, there was a lot of documentation of our personal responses more than documentation of children's learning. There was this process of personal reflection and discussion together, that process that you might call a documentation process, in like a verbal documentation process. And that's how we've changed through that discussion together, trying to grapple with how do we all fit into this space together.
I was very excited to be part of this project as a mentor teacher to the pre-service teachers of Victoria University. This project was a brave and innovative undertaking, a collaboration between Victoria University, the City of Maribyrnong, and the architect firm Public Realm Lab. I saw very strong links to the theories of play works, that playing is innate in humans, that play is a right, and the adults involved advocate for play for all children. I also see it closely linked to the principles of the Reggio Emilia approach, which sees children as having the right, having rights, the right to be seen, the rights as citizens of now, and that they are capable and competent, actively engaged in their own learning. This project made me step away from my comfort zone of what I know of children to a place of trusting children with what they know.